so blessed today to have President and Mrs. Lincoln with us. But before I introduce them, I have to thank two other people, Jim Crabtree and Tina Baldridge, both who live in Springboro, both members of the members of the National Association of Lincoln Presenters and the Lincoln Society of Dayton. Jim is a former teacher for 31 years and has been involved with Mr. Lincoln presentations for about 20 years. Tina is a military wife for 30 years and has been performing in community and military functions for many, many years. And without their help, we could not have President and Mrs. Lincoln here today. Lincoln is not one of the presidents who visited the Golden Lamb. A lot of people think he is, but he's not. He is, however, the only bearded president not born in the state of Ohio. So if you can't tell a Garfield from a Benjamin Harrison from a Rutherford B. Hayes, and you know they all look like they belong on Smith Brothers cough drop boxes, but you know they were presidents, you could say they're born in Ohio. Now, Lincoln didn't make it to Warren County, but he had a relative who did. His grandfather, also named Abraham, had a younger brother named John, and John Lincoln moved to Warren County in 1819. He had a 181-acre farm where Kirby Road meets 123. And he died in 1835, and he's buried at what was then the Baptist Cemetery and is now the Pioneer Cemetery, a mere 6 blocks in that direction on 63. So if you leave by going past, to 75, you will pass the old cemetery on the right. So there were Lincolns here. Mary Todd Lincoln, to my knowledge, also never made it to Lebanon, although she had a neighbor. He lived only 2 miles away, Henry Clay, and he did visit here multiple times. So they both shared connections with us. I am also very pleased to say we have a young lady working with us today in charge of our music. Her name is Miss Amazon, and she is going to help us now. Alexa, play Hail to the Chief.
Here's Hail to the Chief, a U.S. Marine band on Amazon Music.
Ladies and gentlemen, President and Mrs. Abraham Lincoln.
Some of you have already shaken hands with me before. Good to see you here. Good to see you here. Yes, sir. Good to see you. Good to see you here. Thank you. Thank you.
You can tell that my husband is a politician.
Thank you.
Because he's out shaking hands.
Thank you. Abraham. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Mr. President. How are you?
It is such a pleasure to be with all of you today. It's a beautiful day. It's not raining, it's not snowing, and there's no floods.
I guess I can shake hands without music. Good to see you here today. Thank you. Thank you.
My dear, are you going to do that all day?
I'm not campaigning, but I could shake hands. But the music stopped, so I guess I'd better stop then, hadn't I? Okay. Well, I'll shake hands on the way back. Okay, get a couple hands here. Good to see you. Good to see you.
I tried to go to every table before we began,
Good to
but
see
it
you.
just didn't happen.
That
There's
won't
so many
happen. I
here
don't
today.
think- We don't have that much time, I guess. Okay, good to see all of you here. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you. Good to see you. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good to see all of you here. For the rest of you, I'll just pretend like I'm shaking your hand. Good to see you here. Very good. You're good actors and actresses. Very good. Okay. Okay. Well, Mary, you have introduced us, or John has. You ready to go?
Yes, dear.
Okay. Well, we're happy to be here in Lebanon for the first time. We came close by here, 1861, I believe, through Morrow, which is not too far away from here, is it? Okay, let me I never did have these, so I've got to turn something on here. All right, Joe. You get it? We got it. Okay. Sorry about that. So we came by Morrow over here, not too far away, but the first time we've been in Lebanon. I want to thank you for inviting us here today. John, where'd he go? Where did he skip out?
It's over there.
Oh, you can stay, John. That's all right. Okay. Thank you very much. We are happy to be here today. Well, I guess the home of Thomas Corwin. Although he wasn't born here, he came here in his early days and lived here for the rest of his life, I guess. So I want to talk about him and another fellow who came here one time, Clement Vallandigham. I'll talk about those two later. But first of all, I'd like to start off with something kind of light, and then we'll get serious. You know, there was a politician. Politicians like to talk a lot, don't you? Have you ever heard that? Well, there was a politician giving a speech one time to several hundred people, a little bit more than in here. And it was kind of a boring speech. I hope mine's not that way today. But it was kind of boring. He's talking about tariffs and taxes and the way the government ran, and people kind of went, okay, well, we've got that. And some of them were dozing off and not paying a lot of attention. After he spoke for an hour and a half or so, a man in the back took off a shoe and threw it at him. Well, he missed the speaker, but he hit a man in the front row. And the man rubbed his head a little bit, and he stood up and pointed back to the fellow and said, hey, you got another shoe there, I assume? Hit me again because I can still hear him talking. So if I see somebody taking off a shoe back there, I know it's going too long. I'll just stop, okay? But anyway, I want to talk about Thomas Corwin in a little bit because he and I had some similarities. I'll just go ahead and talk about him now. He was born in Kentucky, I believe, and moved here when he was a young boy. And he was governor of Ohio at one time. I think a representative in the state house at one time. U.S. senator at one time. Congressman at one time. And was involved in a lot of politics. And he and I had some similarities. First of all, we were both born in Kentucky. Praise Kentucky. Well, I don't want to go too far with that because that's where Jeff Davis was born. So not everybody who came from Kentucky was really a good fellow. Anyway, Tom had a sense of humor, and so did I. I like to tell stories and hear good stories too. And there was one story that I remember somebody telling about him in Washington. One day he and John Calhoun were talking. Calhoun was from South Carolina, the southern state. And they were talking about this group of mules that were being driven down the street of Washington, D.C. And Calhoun said, well, he looked out there and said, well, I guess those are your constituents. They voted for you, didn't they? And Corwin said, well, no, I think they're going down south and teach those people down there how to read and write. So he had a good comeback. He had a good sense of humor. And that was a similarity, born in the same state, sense of humor. And also, we contested the Mexican War. In 1847, he made a speech in Congress protesting or speaking out against the Mexican War, which he thought was not really valid and didn't think it was really a good idea to go down and have a war with Mexico. So he had a speech in Congress in 1847, I believe it was, and told the people there that he didn't like it, that we were going to war. Some people called him a traitor. You're a traitor, they would call him, because you're not supporting the war. He was asking why. I did about the same thing, maybe about the same time, maybe he's 47, 48. And I said to the president and the Congress, I said, tell me where the spot is where the Mexicans attacked the American troops, which brought on the war. Nobody seemed to know. I said, where's the spot? Where's the spot where the war started? And the president kind of ignored me. After that, they called me Spotty Lincoln. I got the nickname of Spotty Lincoln because they said, was not supporting the war. I was supporting our troops, but I didn't think the war was good. So he and I had some similarities, and those are a couple of them. Now, the other fellow that I might mention is Vallandigham. I think this is a story of the good guy and the bad guy. Vallandigham from Ohio was what you might call a copperhead. He was criticizing the war effort, criticizing me in speeches around Ohio and other places. And finally, General Burnside arrested him one time. I think he was speaking in Mount Vernon or somewhere in Ohio. And he arrested him. He said, "That's enough. You're antagonizing. You're getting people all worked up here. We're trying to win this war, and you're trying to stop it." So they tried him in a military court and put him in military prison. And the idea of the writ of habeas corpus, have you heard of that? Show me the evidence. Show me the body of evidence is what it really means. And so many people are saying, well, you can't do that. You don't have any crime that he's committed. He's just been talking free speech. But the idea was he was affecting the war. And we had to win that war to keep our country together. So Burnside put him in, or had the trial and put him in prison for a while. After a while, he was released and sent down to the Confederacy. You take care of it. Well, I don't think they liked him very well either. Finally, he ended up in Canada, whether it was his own accord or where they sent him up there. He ended up in Canada, actually ran for governor of the state of Ohio from Canada. He didn't win. He would try anything. So then after, in 1871, he came to Lebanon. And he was a lawyer at that time. And he had a case that he was trying. And he was telling some people in, I think back then it's called the Lebanon Hotel, I believe. Now it's the Golden Lamb. He was telling these lawyers and attorneys how he was going to present the case. His client had been accused of shooting a man, and I think his name was Thomas McGee, and the other man was named Tom Miles, something like that. And he was showing these attorneys how he was going to present the case to support his client. And he said, the man who was my client did not kill this man because he was sitting in a chair, and he got up and he pulled out a gun and shot himself. It wasn't my client that did that. He shot himself. And then, going through the action of this man, Vallandigham shot himself. He pulled out a gun and he didn't know it was loaded. He said, "This is what really happened. This is what happened." And he shot it like the man who was killed or charged with was murder, the victim. He said, "This is what happened," and he shot himself. Can you imagine that? He's trying to show that his client did not do it, that the man who was the victim actually shot himself. And he shot himself. Isn't that amazing? So he died the next day, I believe, in Lebanon. So we have the good guy, Thomas Corwin, and we have the bad guy, Vallandigham. He was really, really an ardent, anti-war, copperhead person that didn't like me at all. And so those are the two men that I want to mention here today. And now, I want to go over a couple things here, and then I'm going to let my wife, Mary, speak for the next, what have you got, about an hour or so?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes, dear.
They won't throw shoes at a lady, though. They won't do that.
Okay.
Okay. Our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence to form our country. By the way, January the 14th, I believe that was yesterday, 1784, Treaty of Paris, the United States signed a treaty to end the war. 1784, January the 14th. We were now going to end that war and become a new nation in the world. So anyway, our founding fathers we have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I carry my little book around with me. I really don't need it, but I'm going to look at it here. The Constitution of the United States and the Declaration of Independence. When our founders founded the country, they started off with the Declaration, which said that, among other things, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed with our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, about 80 years later, Alexander Stephens, the so-called vice president of the Confederacy, wrote this, or gave this in a speech. Get my glasses on here, I think. In a speech that he gave in March of 1861, March 21st, 1861, shortly after I had been inaugurated as president. Here it is. The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at that time of the formation of the old Constitution were that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. It was an evil they knew not well how to deal with, but the general opinion of the men of that day was that somehow or other, in the order of providence, the institution would be temporary and pass away. Those ideas, however, were fundamentally wrong. They rested upon the assumption of the equality of races. That was an error. And the idea of is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and moral condition. This, our new Constitution, our new Confederate government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. What a contrast, isn't it? We hold as truths that all people are created equal, that they're endowed with certain freedoms, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. He said, no, that's not true. There's some that are subordinate to another race, and this is the first government in history that's going to do that. They're going to be slaves because they're not equal to the white man. Quite a bit of difference between that and the Declaration of Independence, isn't it? All right, try this one now. Constitution, preamble says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do establish and create this United States of America. Now, here's what Jefferson Davis said February the 18th, 1861. Part of it, not the whole thing, in his inauguration. The declared purpose of the compact of union from which we have withdrawn was to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What was wrong with that? That seemed like it's exactly what the preamble said, isn't it? Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility. What did he leave out? What? Left out the first line, didn't he? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. He didn't say anything about that. He left that out. He did not believe. Now, he's a smart man. I'm sure he knew what it said, but he left it out on purpose because that would contradict what he's doing. A more perfect union does not allow the unions to break up. It means you stay together. He's saying, we're leaving the union. He left it out. There's the contrast between 1800 and 1860, between one group of people in the North and one in the South, who completely disagreed with our founding fathers' idea of our country. So that shows you the ideas that they had and the ideas that our founding fathers had. Now, we had slavery when our country was founded, but the founders of our country said in the Constitution, well, first of all, they did not use the word slavery. They used people of service. Slavery was not used in the Constitution. Then it also said in 1808 there would be no more importation of people of service to our country. You can't import these people from Africa or Haiti or the Caribbean, anywhere. You can't import them after 1808. So they were putting limits on slavery. 1787, the ordinance of 1787, Northwest Ordinance said, no slavery in the states that are formed from this territory, which included Ohio, So our founders thought that over a period of time, this idea of slavery was going to die out. But it didn't. The contrasting views between 1800 and 1860 show you how our country was divided over this issue. Two different parts of the country, two different philosophies of our country, two different philosophies about people. And a lot of things happened in between to end up in a civil war many years later. So therein lies the basis for the argument, the Civil War that occurred in April of 1861, shortly after I had been inaugurated. And I had to deal with that. Now, one more thing, and then Mary has the floor. When Fort Sumter was attacked by South Carolina militia, South Carolina had started this in December of the previous year by saying we're seceding from the Union. Then other states followed along, southern states followed along. And Fort Sumter was attacked. A federal fort attacked by South Carolina, a state attacking a federal fortress. What came to my mind then was, I'd read something previously from Shakespeare, and it went something like this. To be or not to be, that is the question, whether to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune or to take up arms against the sea of trouble and by opposing defeat them. I thought, oh my, how appropriate. Are we going to be a united country? In perpetuity, as George Washington said, this country should last in perpetuity forever. No problem should cause us to break apart. And here they were doing it. So I'm thinking, are we going to be that perpetual union that he spoke about? Or are we going to break up and just fall apart? Do we oppose it or accept it? I said we have to oppose it. I will not be the president that allows this great country to fall apart. We have created an idea, the first in history, that all people are created equal. We have created a government that the government has to respond to the people. Not all people. Even women back then couldn't vote. Slaves, of course, couldn't vote. But we were on the way. We had the right track and the right idea. And I could not, as president, allow this to happen. We will fight it. We will oppose it. And so I called up about 75,000 men to reinforce our army, our military, because we didn't have a big army at that time. So I called them up, and they came from all over the north, many of them from the state of Ohio, to prevent the disunion of our United States of America. I thought we had a great future, but if we allow it to break up, that's no future. That's disobeying, going against all the ideas of our founding fathers. And so we went to war, and it lasted for 4 long years. Now, we're going to fill in between those dates a little bit, and Mary, you're on. You've got it now. Take over.
Thank you, dear.
Okay, you're welcome, dear.
And I'm sorry you're going to be seated behind me.
Oh, that's all right.
Well, just don't pull on my skirt if you think I've been talking too long.
All right, Mary, I'll sit down here and rest.
Okay.
Okay, you got it.
Well, I'm not one to normally give public speeches as the president's wife. However, for today's sake and for history's sake, I'm going to let you know about our lives and with our children. I was born Mary Ann Todd, December 13, 1818, in Lexington, Kentucky. My father's name was Robert Smith Todd, and my mother's name was Eliza Ann Parker. Together they had 7 children. There was Elizabeth Frances Levi, myself, Robert, Ann, and George. Well, when Robert was born, he passed away very shortly after. That was a very sad time. But after the 7th one was born, that was Georgie, then our mother passed away. Can you imagine that household with 7 children and no mother? Oh my. Well, Within a year, Father remarried a woman named Elizabeth Humphreys, and together they had 9 more children. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. There was Robert, Margaret, Alexander, David, Samuel, Martha, Emily, Elodie, and Catherine. We didn't all live in the same house at the same time. However, that house is still standing today, and if you get a chance, go and visit it. It's really interesting, and I've enjoyed going once in a while. Well, when I was about 8 years old, there was a fellow that used to come to our home. He lived about 2 miles down the road. And he and Father would sit in the parlor and talk about politics. I was allowed to sit in there and listen if I was very quiet. And I was on my best behavior. And so his name was Henry Clay. He was a political leader of the Whig Party at the time. And I just adored the man. Why, I remember I must have been about 12 years old. I went up to him and I said, Mr. Clay, if you ever find yourself in the executive mansion and you need a hostess, why would you call on me? And he just laughed and he said, why, yes, Miss Mary, I will. Anyhow, because I was allowed to sit in the parlor and listen, that's where I got my education on politics. And I understood it. And then, I guess it was about that same period of time, I asked my father, Papa, could I please go to school? I really want to go to school and learn. And I was allowed to go. Oh my. At first I went to Shelby Female Academy for about 3 years. And then I switched over to Madame Montel's Academy, where I learned to speak fluent French, parlez-vous français? And then I switched to Dr. Ward's Academy. And I studied Shakespeare, loved it, Victor Hugo. I even took a course on astronomy and enjoyed every bit of it. I was quite a good student. But all in all, I went to school for 13 years. Can anyone guess how many degrees I hold? Why, none whatsoever. Not only could I not vote for the man I would marry later, I couldn't hold any degrees because I was a female. Can you imagine that? Well, never mind. I left school after those 13 years and went to Springfield, Illinois, to live with my oldest sister, Elizabeth, who was married to a young lawyer named Ninian Edwards. And I tell you, Elizabeth and I, because we grew up knowing protocol and etiquette, we would host the most wonderful dinner parties. Why, we would plan a lovely dinner, and then after dinner, there would be music and dancing. And I just loved to dance. Why, there was a fellow that I used to dance with quite a bit. I know he's going to pull my skirt. His name was Stephen Douglas. And you know, Mr. Douglas, stop that dear. Mr. Douglas wasn't much taller than I. And so, you know, and he was a good dancer too, so we just enjoyed each other's company as far as that goes. Now, dear, please don't get jealous because,
I won't.
well, Mr. Douglas and I did not agree on the issues of the day, if you know what I mean. He was of a different party. Okay, and even though he was a suitor at the time, it probably would not have worked well. But never mind about that. I have the perfect man for my husband, dear. I know you're listening. And it's because of that he gives me free rein on my opinion. Not in public, of course, but I try very hard to keep myself composed. Well, let's see. Anyway, one evening, the Edwards had invited a man that worked with our cousin, John Stewart. John was Elizabeth and my cousin. But John was a lawyer. And he had someone working in his office by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Now, I had never met the man before, but I knew that he was very tall and lanky. And so when John Stewart came one evening, as soon as he walked in the door, I knew who it was. Why, that's Abraham Lincoln. And so he came a couple of times after that. And one evening, sorry dear, I'm telling this story.
That's okay. I'm just questioning, is handsome the same as tall and whatever you do?
I said tall and lanky?
Yeah, handsome the same as
Handsome.
lanky?
Oh dear, yes.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yes.
Well, that's all right.
Very, very handsome.
Okay.
Yes, very handsome.
Okay.
Well, a few dinner parties later, this handsome gentleman behind me got up enough nerve to come over and ask me to dance. And he came over and he said, Miss Todd, I'd like to dance with you in the worst way. And I said, I'd be delighted, Mr. Lincoln. And we started to dance. He danced in the worst way. He stepped on my toes, on my feet, on my dress, almost ripped it. So needless to say, we adjourned to some chairs on the side, and we started to chat. And I told him about my background, and he told me about his. Do you know he was born in a log cabin with one window, one door, one chimney, and a dirt floor? I was amazed. You know, most gentlemen try to really embellish their stories and try to impress the ladies. He just told me the way it was. And I was so fascinated that he was so open and to present himself in such a vulnerable way. I was amazed. I really was. And then we started talking about politics. Well, he was amazed that I knew anything at all about politics. And I was amazed that he would even allow me to talk about it. Because you know, Mr. Douglas wouldn't allow it. Well, so he started to court me. Well, when my family found out, they had a fit. They did not want me being courted by that country bumpkin. But I didn't see him as a country bumpkin. I saw him as a man who was honest and open and a man of integrity and a leader. I'll tell you why. I went to school for 13 years. He may have gone to school for a total of 13 months in his entire life. Can you imagine? That told me right away that he was a self-starter. The few times he got to go to school when he wasn't needed on the home front because he was the only son, he took whatever he learned and embellished it and continued on. I was so fascinated because he taught himself how to write in cursive. And I was so enthralled with all those characteristics. I just fell in love with him. And that's what made you the most handsome man in the world,
well,
dear.
Thank you. I'm glad to get that in there, Mary. Thank you. Thank you.
One evening, Mr. Lincoln came over to the Edwards home, and we sat in the parlor, and I noticed that he was very, very fidgety. And he finally looked at me and he said, Miss Todd, I've been giving this a lot of thought. And I want you to marry me. Will you be my wife? And I said, why yes, Mr. Lincoln. And so we were engaged, and we were engaged for quite a few months. Quite a few. And he came back one evening, and I noticed again he was nervous and fidgety, and finally he said, Miss Todd, I don't have money. I don't have the kind of money that you're used to. I can't give you a nice house with curtains on the windows and rugs on the floor, and I can't dress you in those beautiful gowns. I can't marry you. What? He said, I'm sorry, I just can't marry you. I was devastated. I was just devastated. And do you know, all I could say and look at him, Mr. Lincoln, if you should change your mind, come back and ask me again. Well, it was almost a year later when he came back one evening. And he said, Miss Todd, I remember you saying, if I should ever change my mind, to come back and ask you again. And I'm asking you right now, would you be my wife? And I said, Mr. Lincoln, you broke my heart. Are you going to do that to me again? He said, no, my mind is made up. And so, ladies and gentlemen, as soon as he left, I went to my sister Elizabeth and said, Lizzie, he's asked me to marry him again. And guess what? Within 3 days, we got a cake, a minister, and some flowers, and we were married in their parlor before he could change his mind. We lived in a small apartment over the Globe Tavern in Springfield, and we finally had to move into our first and only home in Springfield on 8th and Jackson Street. It looks like this today. We had to add a little bit upstairs for the boys, but it's still open today if you want to go and look at it. We had 4 boys. There was Robert and Edward, William, and Thomas. Now, when little Eddie was about 3, it's such a sad story, but he got a childhood disease. We don't know what it was. We don't have the same terminology that you have now. But that child, that baby, passed away, and it just broke our hearts. But we had Robert, and soon would be Willie, and then Thomas. Well, when little Thomas was born, we gave him a nickname of Tad, because when he was born, he had a big head and a little body, squirmy body, and he just looked like a tadpole. So we called him Tad the rest of his life. And we just adored those boys. And we lived in that house for 17 or 18 years, and it was the most wonderful years in Springfield. Yes, my husband did travel quite a bit, and he was gone a lot. But I'll tell you, I sewed all the clothes for the boys. I did the cooking and the cleaning. We did not own slaves because we were against them. We knew what they were doing to some of the slaves, and it broke our hearts. Human beings should not be treated like that. And so we never owned any slaves. We did have some that would come and help, and we paid them, like my dressmaker. Her name is Elizabeth Keckley. And Elizabeth was a very wonderful, stately woman, and she stayed with me while we were in the executive mansion. The interesting thing about Elizabeth was, most slaves, she was born a slave to slave parents, but most slaves never knew when they were born. They did not have birth certificates. But I knew when Elizabeth was born, it was February of 1818, the same year as I was born. She was born in Dinwiddie Courthouse, Virginia. And how do we know that? Because her master wrote down when his slave had given birth and what was the child's name. And so Elizabeth's mother's name was Aggie, and he wrote down beside that, Lizzie, born February 1818. So that's what is wonderful about Elizabeth. I think I should probably sit down, but first I want to tell you that the boys were wonderful. We loved them. And little Tad, our youngest, loved animals. He always had animals with him all the time. If it wasn't a rabbit or a cat or a dog or a bird, you name it, that child loved them all. So once my husband was elected president, we had to leave Springfield and get on trains, take what we were going to take with us and the boys. But Tad insisted on taking some of his animals. And we just had to allow it because he was not going. He was not at all going if he didn't. So that's where I'm going to stop and let my husband speak for a little bit. Is that okay, dear?
Very good, Mary. Thank you. By the way, what did I bring along with me that I had not had for 30 early years of my life that I'd never had before? I took it with me. What was it? I took
Your
with me.
wife?
Well, yes, I did that, but you know what it was?
Remind me, dear, what? Oh, yes, I do. Oh, yes.
You remember.
Yes. Okay. Well, you can tell that story.
I could, but
Okay.
you might as well.
Hmm?
I had a beard, didn't I?
He had a beard because a little girl who lived in Westville, New York, wrote him a letter and said, "Dear Abe Lincoln," capital A, capital B, that's how she spelled it. My father was at the county fair recently and he saw a picture of you. And I think that if you grew a beard, it would make you look, I don't know what she said, dear, intelligent?
Look better, I think it was. More
Yes. And maybe you would, become president. I know that my father would vote for you and maybe my brothers. And so he thought about that and he did grow a beard. And do you know, once we were on that train going to the executive mansion, we stopped in Westville, New York, and we looked for her. Her name was Grace Bedell. And a little boy said, "I know where she is." And he went back in the crowd and got her and brought her up. And so we got to meet her. We didn't have any girls, and she was precious. She was about 12. And he asked her quite a few questions. Of course, she only answered yes or no, sir. And it was a very pleasant day that we got to see her. And he still, to this day, has that letter.
And the beard.
And the beard, and the beard.
The letter and the beard,
Because
yes.
he showed me the letter and he said, "What do you think of this, Mary?"
Oh, yes.
And I said, "Well, dear, if that child thinks that you could possibly become president by just growing a beard, well,
I did it,
be
too.
my guest."
I did it, and I was elected in 1860. My principal opponent was, who was it now? Mr. Douglas. Mr. Douglas. John Breckenridge and John Bell were the other contestants, and I won that election with the beard. Now, I can't tell you whether I would have won without the beard or not. I don't know. Nobody will ever know that. But if that little girl thought that she helped me win the election, that's fine with me. I did have the beard then and kept it on for the rest of my life. Now, another little story here about Tom Corrin. I keep talking about Tom Corrin. I like the guy. We were friends. And we were in Dayton in 1859, September 17th, I believe it was, wasn't it?
Yes, dear.
And after we completed that journey, we were in Columbus, then Dayton, and then Cincinnati. Came back and carried on a letter correspondence with Tom, and we were talking about the upcoming election, 1860, and what kind of candidate might be the best for the Republican Party. And in one of my letters I said, well, we're going to have to find somebody. We don't want an extreme abolitionist. We want somebody who's kind of moderate, who might foresee the time when slavery is gotten rid of, but we don't want an abolitionist. We can't do it immediately. We can't do that. And he agreed with me. So we had correspondence there the end of September when we came back from our journey here in Ohio. And then in 1860, after I'd been elected, there were some senators in Congress who were afraid that we would have a civil war. And so they got together to try to come up with some kind of a compromise that would prevent a civil war. And I think Tom Corrin was one of those senators who got together. There were about 12 or 13 of them, and they got together and talked about what they could do to help prevent the war. And so, looking for my glasses here, dear. Right there they are. So they got together and they came up with some ideas about how to prevent the Yeah, okay. Let's get it up here. Okay. I didn't break it, did it, Joe? Is it still working? Yes. Still working, okay. Came out of my pocket here. Sorry about that. We didn't deal with this back when I was younger. Okay, so they came up with a compromise hoping to prevent a war. And they actually came up with an amendment. Maybe the first 13th Amendment. We had another one later, but this is the first one, an amendment. When I came into office there in 1861, I found this on my desk. It says, 36th Congress of the United States at the second session begun and held in the city of Washington in the District of Columbia on Monday, the 3rd day of December, 1860. Joint resolution to amend the Constitution of the United States. Resolved by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled that the following article be proposed to the legislatures of the several states as an amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which, when ratified by 3/4 of said legislatures, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution. Here's what it said. Article 13. Like the 13th Amendment. No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state, with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state. In other words, the federal government could not get rid of slavery in those states. If the states wanted to do it, they might want to do it, but the federal government could not. It was on my desk. It had passed Congress and on the way to the states to be ratified completely. But before it went around to all the states, Fort Sumter happened and the war started. This article, this amendment to the Constitution did not go through, but the real one went through on January 31st, 1865. The real 13th Amendment, which said that there would be no more slavery in America. And it said slavery, abolish slavery in America. So this was an attempt to maybe appease or compromise with the South to prevent the war. But it did not. The war happened anyway with Fort Sumter, and this 13th Amendment was not ratified. So he was there trying to help prevent the war, but this did not do it. Now, let me go ahead here. We go to the inauguration on March the 4th, 1861. And as I said before, in April the 12th, the South Carolina militia attacked Fort Sumter, and the war started and lasted for 4 years, and over 600,000 Americans lost their lives. Now, when it started, many people thought it wouldn't last very long. That we had most of the odds, you might say. We had more people, more money, more railroads, more finances, more of everything, but it wasn't happening that way. Some people thought maybe it might last 8 months or a year, but it just kept going on and on and on. And in 1862, I decided that to win this war, we're going to have to do something really drastic. And so I came up with the idea of an Emancipation Proclamation. And what it said, and this is what it looked like in my handwriting back then on parchment paper. I'm not going to read all this, but I'll explain to you what it actually said. But there at the beginning, let me look at the beginning. By the President of the United States of America, a proclamation, whereas on the 22nd day of September, in the year of our Lord, 1862, a proclamation was presented by the President of the United States, containing, among other things, the following to wit, legalese terms. And then it went on to say that 100 days from that day, that I would proclaim in the second proclamation, the real one, that I would list the states in which slavery was still there, and if any slave could get away from those states and make it to the north, they would be free. They'd be free people forever. If you can get away from the states that are still in rebellion, now I'll specify those in rebellion. If you can get away and make it to the north, you will be free. September 22nd, 1862, after the Battle of Antietam, that gave me the opportunity to do that, because in July of that year we talked about that with my cabinet members, and I said I am about ready to proclaim this Emancipation Proclamation, and we had a discussion about that. And some of them said, well, that might be okay, it might be, I'm not sure. Mr. Seward said, well, now, Mr. President, he was one of my competitors in the nomination back in May of that year, of 1860. He said, you know, you might want to wait until we get a real victory on the battlefield. Because if we do it without before we have a victory, it looks like desperation. Wait till we get a victory and then issue it. I said, well, Mr. Seward, I hadn't thought about that. He was really a smart man. I said, well, let's wait. And so I waited and waited. And then it happened. Antietam, September 17th, the victory by Mr. McClellan, General McClellan, who I'd had some issues with before. But he did win this battle. And 5 days later, September 22nd, I issued this proclamation to the people of America. On the first day of 1863, it went into effect. I read it and announced it, and as I said before, if you are a slave in any state that is still in rebellion against the United States of America, you will be free. If you can make it up to our lines, you'll be free. So that was the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Now, the war kept going on and on and on, and we didn't have too many battles. We lost battles at Chancellorsville and other battles, and it wasn't going very well. But in 1863, we had a very definite victory at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And it was on July the 1st, 2nd, 3rd day of the year. And the Union forces and the Confederates met there kind of accidentally. They didn't plan it this way. They just kind of ran into one another. Excuse me. And of course, when two armies meet, what do? Shake hands and say, how are you today? No, they fought. For 3 long days, they fought in and out of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Then on the 3rd day, General Lee, who'd been very good up to that point, made a blunder, a mistake. Cemetery Ridge. Union forces up on top of that ridge looking down, and General Lee said, we have to win this war. We have to win this battle because we're running out of supplies and food and medical things. We have to win it so we can get out and go home. We're going to go for it. Those troops up there, we're going to attack them. We're going up this ridge, this hill, and we're going to win this battle. Well, they shot some of their cannon up there, and some of the cannonballs went over the ridge, not into the soldiers up there. And so the Union was waiting for them. And Pickett's Charge, they called it, because Pickett was a general from Virginia. And about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Lee says, okay, let's go. They started up that hill, that ridge, toward the Union soldiers at the top to try to win that battle. And maybe if they got about halfway up, they let out their rebel yell. Something like that. And you can imagine about 15,000 men doing that. It sounded like a tornado coming. And up that ridge they went, right into the fire and the guns of the Union soldiers on top. A few of them made it to the top, and there was hand-to-hand combat at the top, bayonet against bayonet, hand-to-hand, knife against knife at the top. But finally they were repulsed and pushed back down the hill, back down that ridge. General Lee, when he saw them coming back, he says, it's all my fault. I shouldn't have done that. He realized he made a blunder, a mistake, a military mistake, which normally he didn't do. Normally he wouldn't do that. He probably should have gone around to the backside. Like before, he would split up his troops, and one group would go one way and another, and they'd come in from the back. He didn't do it. He wanted to do it quickly, get it over with. He lost that battle. He lost that battle on July the 3rd, and then on July the 4th, the morning of July the 4th, they packed up and they left to go back home. July the 4th in Mississippi. General Grant won a decisive victory in Mississippi. 2 great battles there on the same day, July the 4th. I read the news about them, and I thought, oh my gosh, this has to be a good omen. This is a good sign. We won 2 big battles here on the same day, July the 4th, the date that our country was born. I thought, wow, that's a good sign. Well, it might have been a good sign, and it was good to win those battles, but the war wasn't over. It went on for another year and a half up until April of 1865. The war would still keep going. We'd still be fighting one another. Now, it was true that they were being pushed back to the south. We were pushing them back to the south, but the Confederacy, the soldiers were still fighting. They were still fighting until April of 1865. And as I mentioned before, the 13th Amendment, the real one, on January 31st, was passed by Congress, and then it would have to go through the legislatures of the states to be approved, but it was approved by Congress on that day, January 31st, 1865. Now, some other things, Mary, might have happened to you during that war. You want to talk about that? Okay, go ahead. You've got it.
Okay, dear. Well, once we got to the executive mansion and we got our children settled, we settled in and we went through the inauguration and the inaugural ball. We sent our oldest son, Robert, away to prep school. And so we had little Willie and Tad left with us. 2 rambunctious boys, let me tell you. They insisted on having uniforms made. Looked something like this. Actually, it looked more like a Cossack, but this is Tad's doll. His name is Jack. I said, darling, wouldn't you like to name him Johnny, like Johnny Comes Marching Home? No, that's Jack. You see, Tad was born with a hole in the roof of his mouth, and he had a bit of a speech impediment. But we could understand him because he was our son. And they were rambunctious. Why, one day, little Willie and Tad were swimming in the Potomac River, and they accidentally swallowed some water. Willie was about 12, almost 12 years old. And both of those boys got very, very ill. But little Willie passed away. And I couldn't take it. Our country was at war with each other. I had half-brothers and my youngest brother, George, fighting in that war. Why, the newspapers called me the little Confederate, the little traitor. But why me? The whole country was at war with themselves. Every family had problems. But after Willie died, I just had enough. I went to my bedroom and I stayed there for 2 weeks. And if it wasn't for little Tad coming in every day, he'd quietly come in and rub my back and say, it'd be all right, Mama, it'd be all right. It'd be all right. Finally, after 2 weeks, I said, I have to get up. I have to. And thank God for little Tad. He was precious, precious child. Well, I finally got myself together. What else could I do? One day, Tad went up to his father and he said, Papa Day, that meant Papa Dear. Papa Day, I want a goat. I want a goat, Papa Day. Oh, that child. Anyway, he finally got himself a goat. His father got him a goat. But not just one goat, it was 2 goats. He named the male Nan King and the female Nan. Oh boy. One afternoon, I was hosting a tea party for the distinguished ladies in the community. We were having a lovely time being served coffee and tea on the silver service and cakes and little sandwiches and whatnot. When unbeknownst to me, Tad was out in the hallway hitching up Nan, King, and Nan to a cart. And all of a sudden, the parlor doors opened. And in he came straight through that tea party, and oh my goodness, we were all wearing our best gowns, and there was coffee and tea spilled everywhere. Oh, I have never been so embarrassed in my life. And wouldn't you know, it would be in the newspaper. And wouldn't you know, that embarrassing encounter would be in the history books. Well, never mind. Anyway, I know that we're probably, time is up, coming up soon. Okay. Oh, well, thank you so much. Well,
Do
I
you
just,
serve supper here too, John?
dear,
Okay.
I just will say one more thing.
Okay,
You stay.
go down, so.
I just want to let you know about the soldiers' home, the old soldiers' home, we called it. It was about 1.5 miles or so up the street from the executive mansion. And, you know, it doesn't matter what the newspaper said. They weren't kind to me at all, and I'm sorry about that. But the only time I got to see my husband because of that dastardly war was at breakfast. That was it. And then he would go his way. But after breakfast, every day that I could, I would take a group of ladies and we would go to the old soldiers' home where we had opened it up to be a convalescent home for the returning soldiers. And we would take little cakes and whatnot. And every day we would go. We would act as nurses if we needed to. We would change bandages. We would read to these men. We would write letters home for them. We would sing to them. Whatever they needed, we would be there for them because I knew what it was like to lose children. And I knew that those letters weren't getting home to their parents in a timely manner. And so it was my heart's desire to let them have some comfort. And that's what we did every single day. And then I had to get home by 3 because Tad would be finished with his tutoring, and I wanted to be with him. But it was the hardest time in my entire life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone else. But we stayed true to each other to the end. There you are, dear.
One final note here, dear. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 1863. I have to do this. I was asked to go there to say a few appropriate words at the dedication of the National Soldier Cemetery in November of that year, November the 19th, 1863. So I put some words together. I didn't write this on the train. I had it prepared pretty much the way I wanted it before we got there, and then I went over it with Mr. Seward, my Secretary of State, very smart man I mentioned before. Stayed at the mayor's home, David Wills, I believe his name was, on the 17th or 18th, and then Mary couldn't go with me. I think the boys were sick, or one of them. You couldn't go. And then the next day came out to say my few appropriate words at the dedication of that cemetery. Well, we went out there, and the man in front of me, Edward Everett, wasn't it?
Yes.
Oh, you've heard. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Edward Everett. Spoke for nearly 2 hours. Oh, he was great, the best orator of the day. And people, some of them, were in tears because he talked about the bravery and the courage of the men who fought there. And some of them might have had a father or a brother or a relative there who fought and was killed. And he just had them spellbound. He was a spellbinding speaker. And I'm sitting there waiting. I'm thinking, oh my, I have to compete with that. I only have a few words, and this guy was fantastic. Well, it came my turn, and I was introduced and stood up at the podium, looked at about 12 to 15,000 people. I thought, well, here goes everything in these few appropriate words. My fellow Americans, fourscore and 7 ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And those are my few appropriate words, I thought, and the people in the audience thought, well, maybe they thought, where's the rest of it? You know, they just heard a 2-hour speech and they're thinking, here's the president, and he only spoke for 3 minutes. Where's the rest of it? Finally, they realized, well, that's all he had. And they gave me polite applause. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 1862. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I wish we better kind of conclude this. As I said before, the war ended April the 9th, 1865, when General Grant surrendered, or General Lee surrendered to General Grant. He knew that he couldn't go any farther. His men had dwindled from about 80,000 to about 30,000. Some of them had been killed and wounded, and some just left. They knew what was happening. They just went home. I'm going home to take care of my family and let the other people take care of that war. So he got together, sent a note to General Grant, and they got together and ended the war. Unconditional surrender Grant, he was called. And they got along. They knew the war was over. They were both good men. They were just fighting for different causes. I think Grant was on the right side of history and Lee was on the wrong side. That was my opinion. So the war ended there on that April the 9th, 1865. There was still some fighting in the South, but basically the main armies had surrendered. Well, Mary, what do you think about this whole situation?
Dear,
Yes.
now that the war is finally over,
Yes.
and you stayed true, you wanted to keep the Union together,
Yes.
I think we deserve a little bit of relaxation.
Really?
Well, there's a play being presented across the street.
Yes.
It's called Our American Cousin.
Mm-hmm.
It's a humorous play, dear. I think you would enjoy it. Would you like to go?
We need some humor, some laughter.
Yes.
And something light and easy
Yes.
to take in.
Oh, let's do go.
You ready?
Yes.
We'll get the carriage and
Okay.
we'll go.
Oh, good.
Okay, thank you very
Good.
much. Okay. We'll go this way?
Okay.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Come, dear.
Okay.
Hmm?
Here we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. You know the rest of that story, and we're not going to talk about it. Okay, thank you. Really enjoyed being here in Lebanon, the home of Tom Corwin, and just enjoy being here. Didn't we?
Oh, yes.
We really enjoyed it. Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Zimkus.
Oh, you're
John.
quite welcome.
And we really enjoyed being here with you today, and maybe sometime we might come back again. Okay. Thank you very much.
Let me have that. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. President and Mary Lincoln, and also Jim Crabtree and Tina Baldridge. Hope to see you next month when we'll be talking about Beetle Station. So have a good January. And a good July.